for our first Newsmaker session this morning. NABJ, please join me in offering a warm welcome to Eric H. Holder, Jr.
Afterwards. Okay, good.
Wow, huh?
Hey, it's still Ricky from New York, you know? Well, it's a real pleasure to be here with you today, and I want to echo President Obama's words of thanks that for all that you and your team have done to bring so many accomplished and so many aspiring journalists here with us today. I know the President is very sorry that he couldn't be with us in person today, but I can assure you that when I get back to Washington later on, I will bring back your personal birthday wishes to him. I was kidding him yesterday. He's very upset about the fact that he's turning 50. It still looks pretty good, I think, you know, for a 50-year-old. And I celebrated a milestone birthday myself earlier in the year, 10 years beyond his, so I told him, you know, 50, you can breeze right through that. 60 is when you start getting concerned about things. As a long-time admirer of NABJ's great work, I'm honored to be included in this annual gathering and to be among some of the most dedicated and distinguished journalists in the country. I'm really also grateful for the opportunity to salute the achievements and the contributions that have come to define the National Association of Black Journalists. And as always, I'm glad to be here in Philadelphia. Now, one of this city's proudest sons and one of the association's leading founders, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Asil Moore, has often said, and I quote, he's often said that there are two types of people, those who are and those who wish they were from Philadelphia. Now, he and I will get along. He's a wonderful man, but I'm a native New Yorker. And so I'm not going to comment on that statement, but I do believe that it's fitting that you have gathered here this week in the birthplace of our republic to discuss the essential role that journalists always have and always must play in strengthening this nation. Now, since America's earliest days, its best journalists have championed the ideal that every participant in our society has not only the right, but the obligation to hold its leaders accountable. And as President Obama just said, to speak truth to power by raising awareness about what is right and what is wrong. Now, throughout our history, the efforts of journalists have rendered a clear picture of life in this country, of the historic achievements that we have made and the harsh realities that too many have faced. Without your work, we would not have a starting point for progress, or in many cases, the pursuit of justice. And because of this, I consider journalists, and this will sound a little strange here, but give me a break on this one. I consider journalists to be essential partners in the administration and the achievements of justice. And that's not to say that lawyers and journalists are always going to see things eye to eye, that the Justice Department is always going to be in a place where you want us to be. But we do share, I think, a professional obligation, and that is to seek the truth. Now, that is a tremendous and critically important responsibility. It is also the guiding force for this Department of Justice. And 36 years ago, it was the driving factor in the establishment of this association. Now, some of you may not remember back that far, and many of the students here weren't probably even born back then. But those of us with a few gray hairs and receding hairlines can recall a time when, as Mr. Moore once put it, and I quote again, if you read a newspaper, the only black people mentioned were entertainers and criminals. Black people never died. Black people never got married. They were unremarkable. But the picture that was being painted was not an accurate picture. It wasn't a true story, unquote. No, it wasn't. And in 1975, those frustrations inspired 44 journalists to come together in a really bold, unprecedented effort. In launching NABJ, they aimed to ensure that the full American story was told, that a diversity of perspectives were represented, and that the lives, struggles, and achievements of people of color, and of all those who had been left out and left behind in our society, were no longer overlooked. Now, it was a simple idea, but it was a transformative moment. And thanks to the determination of your founders and of like-minded journalists from across the country, efforts to change the status quo and to shine a light on disparities in both reporting coverage and in the journalism industry really took hold. And the change is a credit to NABJ's founders, members, and supporters, even if it's credit that you don't often receive. Now, in the last 3.5 decades, this association's membership numbers have grown from 44 to more than 3,000. Today, NABJ stands among the top tier of professional organizations of any industry in this country. Your innovative work to promote responsible and inclusive journalism, to expand educational and internship opportunities, and to provide professional development resources, as well as critical support for men and women of color who aspire to build a career in journalism, have set you apart. And as I look out over this crowd of current and future industry leaders, it's really obvious to me that your efforts have been extremely successful. Now, I'm especially grateful for the contributions that NABJ members have made in drawing attention to and directing our national dialogue toward the divisions that we must bridge and the urgent problems that we must address. Now, at times, your work has helped to launch investigations, to advance prosecutions, and to enhance the efforts of law enforcement. And by raising awareness about unacceptable public safety issues and public safety threats, widespread financial fraud, hate crimes and civil rights violations, gun, gang, and drug-related violence, organized crime operations, human trafficking victims, deficiencies in our indigent defense system, and disparities in our sentencing policies, you've also rallied our nation's leaders and citizens, and in many instances, our nation's Justice Department, to action. When I look back at the work that the Justice Department has done, and I think the extraordinary progress that the administration has driven over the last 2.5 years, I am extremely proud. We have revitalized the Civil Rights Division. We have spearheaded new task forces to combat financial fraud. We've launched the landmark Access to Justice Initiative. We've taken unprecedented steps to protect our young people from violence and exploitation. We have helped to advance long overdue hate crimes legislation and at long last reduced, not yet eliminated, but reduced the unfair sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine offenses. But I recognize also that these accomplishments may never have been realized without the work that for years journalists have done to put a face on the needs and the injustices that those of us in government and in law enforcement must address. And although you too have good reason to be proud, you must not become complacent. I have not, and the President has not. We will not be complacent. We have reached a defining moment, I believe, in this country. And our nation's journalists are uniquely positioned to help focus our national dialogue not on just those issues that occupy the 24-hour news cycle, but that really matter, on the challenges that will really determine our nation's future, and on the struggles that we, quite simply, cannot afford to ignore. You can report the fact that the majority of children in this country, over 60% of them, have been exposed to crime, abuse, and violence, and that as a result of that exposure, as both witnesses and as victims, they are likely to be engaged in all kinds of negative behaviors. When conversations center on the fact that African Americans are disproportionately jailed, you can ask, why are we not also discussing the fact that black people are also disproportionately victimized by crime? You can question why, although African Americans make up about 13% of our nation's population, we represent nearly 50% of this nation's homicide victims. And why the leading cause for young black men, those aged 15 to 24, the leading cause of death is homicide. You can challenge our fellow citizens to consider how our nation can risk losing so many of our nation's future teachers, physicians, artists, attorneys, and journalists to violence. You can encourage our nation's leaders to recognize that 1.5 American children have a parent who lives behind bars, that the majority of African American households nationwide do not include a father, and that the children growing up in these households are more likely to live in poverty, more likely to perform poorly in school, more likely to commit crimes, and more likely to abuse drugs. These are issues that we have to talk about. You can shed light on the fact that in America today, Black and Hispanic 12th graders are, on average, reading at the same level as 8th graders who are white. And the graduation rates for African American males currently lag 30% below the rates for white males. You can continue to ask why many of our nation's minority communities were uniquely and disproportionately affected by mortgage fraud and other financial schemes that undermine the dream of home ownership in some of our nation's most fragile neighborhoods. Now, these are just a few of the serious problems that we now confront. Of course, solving them is not your responsibility alone, but leading the way in sharing and telling the stories of all those who are in need, who are at risk, and who are struggling against injustice and silence is your responsibility. As journalists, you have an extraordinary opportunity, and yes, you have a responsibility, I believe, to ensure fairness and to expand opportunities, not only within your profession, but within our entire nation. Now, make no mistake, every person in this room has benefited from the generations of American journalists who took their professional obligations to tell the complete story of our society seriously. And this is certainly true for me as well. I grew up in Queens in the 1950s, and I saw on a daily basis the struggles of people who lost faith in seeing the promise of justice fulfilled in their lifetimes. But from the articles that my parents discussed, from the headlines that I read, and from the historic news reports that my mother made sure that I watched, I could sense that change was coming. Throughout the 1960s, our nation's journalists, through the turmoil, the violence, the resilience, and the reforms that ultimately characterized the civil rights era, came into homes and came into communities across this country as a result of the work of journalists. Even when I wasn't witnessing progress in my own neighborhood, I was reading about it. I was seeing it on television. In essence, I was experiencing it. I was fascinated and I was inspired by sit-ins and by marches, by freedom rides and by ballot drives, and by encouraging leaders like Dr. King, Medgar Evers, Rosa Parks, and Attorney General Robert Kennedy. I remember the pride that I felt when I learned that in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 African American college students had courageously defied the laws of segregation, and by sitting down at a Woolworth's lunch counter, they had stood up for the cause of justice. I felt the same way three years later, in 1963, as I watched reports that James Hood and Vivian Malone, a wonderful woman who later became my sister-in-law, they had stepped past Governor George Wallace to integrate the University of Alabama. And I was overcome with pride 4 years after that when I read that Thurgood Marshall had finally taken his historic place on our nation's highest court. Now, although so many more barriers have been broken since then, and so many other obstacles have been overcome, we still have much to do. The work of building a more perfect, a more inclusive, a more just union for all members of our society is not over, and it is now ours to carry forward. On behalf of my colleagues, I want you to know that today's Justice Department is committed to advancing that work. But we cannot make the progress that we would like or help the people who need us most on our own. That's why today I'm here to ask each of you to keep up your work. Keep asking the tough questions. Keep shining a light on the challenges that we must face and the injustices that we must remedy. Keep working to ensure integrity and diversity in your profession. Keep insisting that the full story of America is told. And above all, keep seeking out the important truths. Now, once again, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak with you and to join you in celebrating all that NABJ has helped to achieve. I look forward to your continued progress and to all that we will accomplish again together in the days ahead. In the work of strengthening our nation and serving the American people, I am grateful and very proud to count you all again as partners. Thank you very much.